So again, my name is Samuel Caraballo. I'm joining you from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm a widget ambassador, and also I'm a science teacher teaching in Boston Public Schools. And I am glad and honored to be part of this speaker series. First thing first, I would like to show you different things you could do with BookWidget. It's part of my class flow to always use an agenda to let our users know what we're planning to discuss in a time together, our time together. So I made an effort to use on all of my slides at least one widget from BookWidgets to show you what other ways you can come up with different tools and resources to engage your students. First of all, I like to show you the agenda and that I created with the checklist widget. I'm gonna click on it and you're gonna see the agenda for today. So it's a dual purpose here. I like to obviously show you what we're planning to discuss, but also I like you to know that there is a checklist widget that you can use for many activities within your classes. In this instance, I'm using it for the agenda. So for today, we're gonna go through a brief introduction. And as part of that, we'll jump in right ago to the science and engineering practices that many science teachers are required to exemplify within their classroom or within their cohorts or whoever they are teaching to. Number three, we're gonna go through how is it that BookWidgets allows us to implement those science practices in our classroom or the place where we teach. Specifically, we'll look at vocabulary support strategies with BookWidgets, modeling and labs, science literacy resources within the platform, BookWidget platform, and widgets for research. Number four, we'll jump into assessments and evaluation tools that will allow you to have a snapshot or a specific look at the performance, your students' performance in the classroom. And lastly, we'll separate some time, probably 10 minutes or so, for your questions, for a question and answer section, right? So let's jump right ahead. First of all, as science instructors, we are required to address different skills. And one of the list of skills are sometimes encompassed in something we call the science and engineering practices, the SEPs. And also I'm gonna use another widget within BookWidgets to show you how I have decided to arrange those practices, not only for myself as a organization tool, but also for people who would like to learn more about these practices. In this case, I'm using the tip tiles widget. I'm gonna click on it, and you're gonna see that I have managed to come up with 8 different tiles, and each one of those tiles is describing a specific practice that we wanna see exemplify, and we wanna see display in our instructions to our students in our classrooms. So as part of this, as you could see, this specific widget allows you to organize content and allows you to incorporate or embed links. There's a link included here that we'll talk more about that first practice, which says asking questions and defining problems. That's one of the practices that all science teachers want to implement within their classroom. And in this BookWidget example, you can click on the link and it will take me straight to the National Science Teaching Association, where you could see the different rubrics for different levels of instruction. By the way, I think I didn't mention it, but I'm a high school teacher, but most of the things that we will discuss today, it's applicable to all levels of instructions, even higher learning as well, right? So again, I'm gonna go back to that widget that I created, but all I wanted to show you here is that we can incorporate the knowledge of our practices, the science and engineering practices, as well as different resources that people can access to remind themselves what are the stipulations for those practices and how is it that I am able to implement those in my courses. Second practice here, we see developing and using models. For number 3, we got planning and carrying out investigations. 4 says analyzing and interpreting data. 5, using mathematical and computational skills. Number 6 is constructing explanations and designing solutions. Number 7, engaging in argumentation or in argument from evidence. Number 8, obtaining, evaluating, communicating information. So the science teacher has lots on her plate, on his plate, in terms of the things we want to see exemplify in our courses. Now, this is where BookWidget comes in handy. Again, I'm going to go through this and I'm going to checklist. Never underestimate the power of a checklist. My students love to be able to trace where we are in the class. Hopefully you will use this as a pacing guide for your different lectures and instruction in the class. Right. So just to share a little bit about the flow in my classroom, all of this logos that you see represents different platforms that I have used in my classroom with my students. And I am glad to tell you that BookWidgets allow integration for each one of these, right? So when I decided to start using BookWidgets, that was in the year 2018, I did not have to forfeit my usage of other tools in order to use BookWidgets. BookWidget allow me to integrate to places like Google Classroom, which is right now is the learning management system of preference for my school. I've been able to use things like Nearpod or Edpuzzle or Kahoot or Padlet. All of these tools are, you are able to incorporate these tools when you're using BookWidgets as your interactive learning platform, right? So that's important to let you know when we are asking you to try BookWidgets, when we're asking you to implement resources with BookWidgets, you will find that this is a tool that allows you to use all the resources that you might be using at this point, right? So first of all, I would like to show you some of the capabilities of BookWidgets to help students develop vocabulary skills. Science courses have a language of its own, right? There's a lot of concepts, a lot of terminology, and we're constantly looking for tools and ideas on how to help our students come up to speed with all the terminology that they found in our courses, whether it be biology, chemistry, physics, environmental sciences, even some mathematical and engineering. So I'm going to show you one example of flashcards. You might have heard of this, but if it's the first time you're looking at this widget, you will be impressed with the fact that there are lots of features in here that could help your students come up to speed with different terminology in our classroom. For example, we have a simple term just as beaker, but instead of giving them just a textual description, the flashcards allows you to embed and incorporate images where your students can actually have access to the concept in a visual way, right? As you can also see, there is a study and practice mode. Once the students have access to these flashcards, they can test their knowledge to whether or not they understand the term or the concept that has been shared with them. There is also another feature that it has been incorporated into our flashcards, which it's one of my favorites, which is this speaker right here. If I click here, Vapor, you can actually, I don't know if you can listen to it on your side, but if you were on my screen, you could hear Vapor, that the actual pronunciation of those terms are shared with the students as well, right? So this is a go-to tool that I use with my students with all the terminology that I'm currently teaching this year, biology. I teach 9th grade biology, and my students thanks to BookWidget, have access to assortments of different terms and concepts that they need to know while they are in the class. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of things we have used in our classroom. And again, we can share not just the concept, textually speaking, but they also have access to visual cues in terms of what we're talking about in the classroom. And also they can hear
digital scale,
the actual pronunciation of those terms. This has been key for many of our English language learners in my classroom when they are trying to find out what is the pronunciation for these terms. They have access to that in the actual widget from BookWidgets. Now, that's one of the concepts that I wanted to show you. Also, sometimes our students need some variety in terms of the way they're accessing those terms and those terminologies. So I will share with you also an example of a crossword puzzle, which is another strategy that has worked very well in my classroom, because it allows the students to confirm whether or not they not only know the concept, but whether they know how to spell the concept correctly, and whether they are able to comprehend the actual definition of that concept. It's more interactive in the sense that they are asked to insert the terms that are being presented to them. So I think this is also another powerful tool that I'm constantly using in my classroom, looking for different ways in which my students can have access to the terminology that we are expressing and sharing in the classroom, right? So for many of our students, the flashcards are just enough for them to test or quiz themselves, but the crossword puzzle brings another level of interaction where it's not just something you are passively retaining, but you are actively also including demonstrating your comprehensions of those terms, right? Lastly, there is also a feature within widgets that provides a word search. And this is an example of some of the terms and concepts we go through in my 9th grade biology class. And a word search also is another engaging way in which they are not just looking at textual cues for terms that they need to know, but they're engaged in looking for them in a specific way in where they can be more creative and try to use other skills within the classroom. One of the things that I do, I call them the vocabulary blitz. I allow my students to work in pairs to try to find out the concepts they're working with, and the students who finish first the process, they can get another incentive for another activity. So there are different ways in which you can incorporate just individual learning, plus also group learning or cooperative learning based on the activities that you've seen in the ones that I presented so far. So that's some of the features that you can get with BookWidgets, specifically when it comes to terminology, vocabulary terms, and concepts that needs to be mastered in order to practice those science and engineering practices, right? If we're asking our students to define and corroborate data, it is important for them to understand what is the term, what are the terms that we are trying to define, and what are the definitions of those concepts we are trying to master in our classroom. Another important area as a science teacher that I found out that BookWidgets is my go-to is science literacy. Most of the content that many of our students are going to access when it comes to science are in different journals, articles, newspaper articles, articles you can find on the internet. So one of the strategies that I have implemented in my classroom using BookWidgets is the split worksheet. And I'm going to show you specifically how powerful is this specific widget for improving science literacy within your classroom. Two things before I click. Every single widget that you see that has this camera icon in it means that while they are working on the worksheet you are creating, you have live access. We'll talk about that later on, but you have live access while they're working through the worksheet. And that is a powerful evaluation and assessment tool, whether it be formative or summative, but this is super powerful. You will know by the end of this workshop that I think the split worksheet is perhaps one of my most cherished widgets that I have within BookWidgets. Let me show you this example. So here, we all share different articles with our students. The problem is that sometimes, you have articles, then you have worksheets, you have different sites, different links. You can assign this through different platforms. But I want you to take a look at what has happened here. On the split worksheet, I have placed the article that I want my students to read on one side of the screen. While the worksheet they will need to access while they read is right next to that article. To me, this has been a game changer for the fact that the students only need one single tab to carry out the task that is at hand. Another important feature in terms of accommodation, especially in my classroom, some of my students require different apps that will help them read the content that is on those articles. This is a PDF article that I have used. I have incorporated into this widget, but my students have the power also to select the text within that PDF. That's a feature you can use within BookWidgets. And depending on the type of apps or applications they have, text to speech, I'll show you an example.
How to find the next pandemic for us before it finds us.
So not only my students who are reading at level can access this content, but students who need support with the reading can use the article, incorporate those words into their specific app that reads for them the content, and they actually will have access to the content of that article. On the other side, as you could see, there are different questions. This is called the text-rich question that allows students to formulate their answers in a paragraph format. They have different choices in terms of the colors they can use for different terms or different specific parts of their answers. Sometimes I give them instructions in terms of which, if you're writing a thesis statement in terms of your answer, please put that in red. They have access to that. If you are including an important description, I might say, please highlight that in black or blue or green. So the choices are, depending on what you want to do, the choices are pretty much very extensive in terms of what they can produce when they are using this type of worksheet, right? Another topic that we'll talk later on, and something that I will touch on, is that BookWidget also gives you the opportunity to incorporate the voices of our students. We'll talk about that in more details as we go, but the only text is not the only choice for entering answers. BookWidget also allows the recording of answers. In fact, the students can record their voices while they answer a particular question, and you will have access to those too. We'll talk more about that in closer to the end of the presentation for today. Right. So we've looked at the science practices. We've looked at vocabulary. I'm also going to talk about the second one, the other example that I have for science literacy, which also has been a game changer in my classroom. With all the resources that we now have, audio resources with different podcasts, different shows that are talking about science, to mention one, Science Friday is one of the shows that I assign to my students. The split worksheet allows you to provide the link for a specific podcast episode that in this case talks about stability and change in the Serengeti National Park. And this is a podcast episode that my students can play within the widget. And as they listen to that content, there's several questions waiting for them so they can provide and demonstrate their understanding of what that episode was presenting. So this to me has been also another way to incorporate, just to move away, not just, textual ways in which you can express your knowledge, but use the strength of my auditory learners to entice them to become more aware with the resources that are beyond my classroom when it comes to science. So having a link to specific podcasts, different episodes, there's all sorts of media that is related to science that you can incorporate in this type of worksheet, the split worksheet, that you can also use and try to spice things up in your classroom in terms of different ways to access scientific content beyond what we do in the class, right? So third, I would like to talk to you about one of those major practices we talked about. It's analyzing and interpreting data, right? We are asking our students to carry out investigations. And that's an essential concept within any science course. BookWidget, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of things you could do to do exactly that in the classroom. The first one that I want to show you, it's a virtual lab exercise. And these resources are available outside of BookWidget. But the important part here is that BookWidget allows you to incorporate those resources within one tab where students don't need to be navigating the entire universe of the internet to actually carry out an investigation. I don't know if you're familiar with different apps that we have within schools to restrict the usage of different sites in the computer. So when I have my students working on one single tab, I have different ways and different tools within my classroom just to limit the usage of my students to one single tab. This is the only tab they need to complete this assignment. And in here, they still have access to the different parts of the simulation. They have access to whatever was, this would be in different tabs within another browser. You can have all of those information, all of those pieces of information included within one single tab of a widget you create with BookWidgets. At the time of running experiments, my students can, if they would like to have a better access to the content, they can change the dimensions of the book, of the split worksheet. So they can actually look at the things that are taking place on the parameters that they need to manipulate. And they will still have access to the questions on the side, but they have flexibility in terms of accessing the content and moving things around, right? So another important thing, while we're talking about things that they can do in the computer, BookWidget has other means and methods to incorporate whatever is going on in the classroom. If I was to ask my student to provide a snapshot of what is their thinking process while they are doing this in the classroom, it's not limited to what they can type, but I can ask them to provide an image through this specific question, which is called the photo insert question. They can click on it, and whatever they have already on their, they can upload photos to their drive, and from there they can actually incorporate some of those images. We can look at those examples later on. So, but the important part here is that BookWidgets not only allows you to embed all your content digitally, but the worksheets that you are creating allows also for incorporating what's going on in real life in your classroom. Any type of hand work that you want to include. Sometimes I'm asking them to draw what they see. Well, so they don't have to draw it on the computer. They can draw it on paper, and then they can provide an image of their model based on their observations and based on the parameters they change in here. I can also ask them to take a screenshot of what's going on here, so I could see the results at the time of grading their examples. I can ask them to incorporate those resources into the widget. I'm gonna with that, for example, they can give me a screenshot of what their data looked like at a specific time. Not only that, that's not only good for me, but that's also good for them when they have to go back and make corrections. They already had a specific snapshot of how their data look when they were carrying this investigation, right? So we'll talk about all different types of questions you can incorporate, but the main point here is that BookWidgets facilitates the implementation of models and lab and investigations within the classroom that are not just bound to the digital world, but it's also capable of incorporating things in activities that are hands-on activities that are taking place in the classroom that very same day, right? Another powerful feature that you might also know, you have access, real live access to each of your students' work then the moment they are coming up with the results of their investigation. So that's important to, we'll give you an example of how that works, right? Let me see, I think we can look at this example that I have here, which is a little different. Actually, let me, there's another platform that you might be familiar with, which is the PHET, the PhET simulations. BookWidget allows you to incorporate each one of those simulations within the split worksheet or any other worksheet, as long as you have the embed code or the link to these activities, right? So if you have in the past worked with the PHET simulations, just so you know, you can use those simulations together with any type of worksheet you create in terms of the, the skills that you want your students to come up with. So that's not a limitation, right? BookWidgets, it's not asking you to forfeit your usage of those tools. On the contrary, you're able to incorporate those skills, those resources, those simulations, those websites into the worksheets that you already have. And you might say, but why not do it on paper? Well, again, you have to be mindful that when you are creating this widget or this worksheet, you are creating something that could be self-graded. You are creating something that could be monitored on the spot. Instead of you looking at all the screens or all of your students, you can have a centralized place when you can identify what are the students who are struggling, what are the students that are idling, right? So, but all of these tools can come together in the science classroom to help our students develop investigation skills and specifically modeling and interpretation of data while they construct their virtual labs, right? So that's an important and indispensable tool that I currently use within my classes when it comes to modeling in labs. We could go through other examples later on if people have more questions. Right. So there is a new modality that I found out that it's the stations work, right? There's digital stations that could be implemented in the classroom, but sometimes not all the students are in the classroom. Sometimes you are in a hybrid environment and we're asking our students to have access to the same content. I'm going to show you another widget that is called the Web Quest. And I have adapted those widgets to reflect different type of stations that I want my students to travel. Right? This could be done individually or this could be done in pairs. But this is an example of evolution stations in my biology class. When we go through the evolution unit, I have constructed this web quest where they can go to different stations, work on the content that is provided in each one of those stations. And each of those stations have a learning worksheet where they can demonstrate what they learned throughout that specific content they access in that specific time or station that they visit, right? So this is another way in which we can engage our students through BookWidgets. I used to do stations manually, but I've seen that when I do it digitally, the collaboration between students is increased in the sense that, people don't have to be together in the same space to work together with the stations. They can actually access this from different points in wherever they find themselves, whether in the classroom or in a hybrid environment. Right. Yeah, let me show you another one that we had, cancer digital stations. They have to travel to each one of them. There are different activities. There's a worksheet here. There's a link to another article that I want them to access on that particular station. On the stations, you can put passcodes. So the people who only finish this station have the passcode to move on to the next one. You can open it up to different people working in a group. One student will take station 1, another person will take station 2. There are different ideas or different ways in which you can implement these resources when you work in groups or individually. But the options are limitless technically. But this is something that is facilitated through the usage of BookWidgets, right? So that's one of the highlights of things that I do in my classroom using this platform. So we're going to transition to independent practice. Sometimes our students are absent in the classroom and I want them to go through specific content that I might not be able to be with them right away, but they have access to it through certain slides. Maybe you have a PowerPoint presentation, you have things you have created through the years, and you want them to access those resources to catch up on things they were missing on their own. I'm going to show you an example of a worksheet that I created where I have specific slides for my students. And this one is a review on macromolecules. I already had this set of slides that are sitting lonely on a drive somewhere in my computer. I can bring those slides, incorporate that, embed that on a BookWidget worksheet. I can have my students look at the slides at the same time where they work on certain activities to corroborate their understanding of that specific concept. In this case, they could go through my slides to learn more about the macromolecules, differences between carbohydrates, lipids, protein, and nucleic acids. They will have that information in there. They can, it's self-paced. They can go at their own pace as they go through this. But at the end of that activity, I will ask them to then sort. This is another widget or a question type that you have in BookWidget. They can sort different categories based on what they access on those slides, right? So any of these statements can be placed on any of these categories. I'm not saying that that is right, but I'm just saying that they can grab their content and they can actually find out if they got the correct sorting or categorization of these terms, right? Another important thing, you can set up your BookWidget worksheet to give the students a chance to look at whether or not they got the right answer and make corrections. That's something that is allowed in the BookWidget platform when you set it up as so. We'll show you how to do that in more details at some point today. Right. Another thing that I have here to just to show you, there's some different ways in which you can provide examples of mastery of the concept. Here we have a matching exercise where students are supposed to find out what is the corresponding image that goes with carbohydrates. What would be the corresponding image with lipids and proteins and nucleic acids and so forth. Right? If they made a mistake, they can actually go through another question and try to erase that. But that's something that BookWidgets also allows. Instead of just have a paper where you just put letters, you can add images and match images to text. You can match images to audio. You can record your voice saying something and they can match that to that as well. Lastly, I don't know if you heard of the platform Kahoot. It's sometimes I use that to assign certain assignments for people who are missing classes. And here I can add my name and my email. All in this case, you have to access, put your email to identify you as the person who is doing the Kahoot. But it's something that you can also include in your BookWidgets, right? I'm already signed in, that's what it's saying, but they will have access to this actual platform while they test their knowledge on this concept, right? So you have an example of slides that you might already have. You can incorporate that to a BookWidget worksheet. You have certain activities that require engagement and confirmation of understanding. You have matching exercises. You also have incorporation of other tools that you might be already using in the classroom. It could be also embedded there, and you can use it as an extra layer of confirming whether or not the student is understanding the concepts. All right, so that's more or less for independent practice. We'll fill out some questions if you have more questions, technical questions in terms of how to do that. So if you ask me, as I mentioned before, what are my favorite question types for science? Obviously, there are traditional ways of asking concepts, especially if you are relying on many of the worksheets on paper or Word documents that you had. You can convert those to BookWidgets. But the advantage of using BookWidgets is technically those things that you will not get in other platforms. One of those is the audio recording. Sometimes I want my students just to tell me in their own words, how do they define a concept? Instead of just typing the answer, I want to hear their voices. I want them to also use their speaking skills to demonstrate understanding on scientific context, right? So the audio recording, which we could show you an example of that later on, but it's one of the features that you have within BookWidgets that I think in my case has revolutionized the way I teach, because I'm asking kids not only to type in their answer, not only to match their answers, but I'm asking them to use their words and explain things in their own words, right? So that's a new level of understanding, a new level of mastery. Can you explain a concept to me? So I got a centralized place where all of their answers will be recorded and I can access them one by one. We can show you how to do that at some point today as well. The other one will be annotated pictures. That's an important type of question you have within BookWidgets. I'm going to show you an example. Any type of diagram that you might find on a textbook or resources that you have, it's fair game in terms of what you can do within the annotated question type. This is a diagram between photosynthesis and cellular respiration that I've used with my students. But this is, I could pass this to my students and say, be a passive recipient of knowledge. On the other hand, with BookWidget, I can convert that same diagram as an active participation exercise. Together with the information we're discussing in class, I could ask my students, I can convert this diagram that was just a passive way to receive information into an active way in which I can test their understanding of those concepts, right? So each one of those things could be done with the type of question that we call in BookWidgets the annotated picture, right? So that's a powerful way to look at your content that you might be already sharing with your students. You can convert this into an interactive example. The beauty of BookWidgets, you can actually assign graded aspects and answers for all of those boxes that you have here, right? So it's not just that you are allowing them to type on a PDF, right? You are technically monitoring what they're typing while there is a right and correct answer for each one of those boxes that could be self-graded. That's an important aspect that has saved me a lot of time in terms of my workload. I have 125 students that I have to look after every single day. When I share things like this, I already have a template of what the right answers are, and they are able to share the answers, and I can quickly go through their work, and I'll show you more on that in the evaluation section of our talk. Again, another diagram from the internet, textbook, things that I already had. I can convert that diagram into a participatory exercise, right? They can have access to the same diagrams that you already have, but now they are becoming interactive. You can cross out those, and each one of these boxes will be graded with the key that you insert for each one of them, right? So that's a powerful way to look at the content that you might have been already using, and now you can spice up and make it more interactive for your students. Lastly, we have the whiteboard question and the photo question. I think I mentioned a little bit more about that, but specifically when I used to teach physics, there was lots of diagrams, lots of things that I wanted my students to understand about concepts. And in here, it's not enough to have the graph, but when you have the power to make different annotations within a specific graph, you can have your students calculate all sorts of things based on the assigned tasks they have. They can manipulate things. They can type on those graphs. I like to know what the slope of the line in here is. I can make those calculations. I can allow them to open up different spaces within this widget to make sure that they have a crucial understanding of what that data is telling them, right? So this is an important aspect specifically for science teacher, having access to a whiteboard where you can incorporate images already in there, and you can track what your students, how are they making sense of the data that is being presented to them, right? All of that in a digital format. Photo question, I already talked about that. Now, so we can spend more time if you have more questions. So lastly, I just want to also make emphasis on two major features of BookWidgets. And that is access to live features within this platform. So say that I assign something to my students and I go to the live option. I can look at the class that I'm teaching at that very moment, and BookWidget will allow me to look at what they are doing at any given time in the live mode, right? If I was to click on photosynthesis and cellular respiration, I don't think anyone is working on it right now, but if they were, I would see the list of students who are going through this specific widget live and the live mode, right? So that's an important feature that allows me to do lots of formative assessment while students are taking a specific task or they completing a specific task. I can see where they are. Not only that, I can actually find out whether or not they have the right answers or not, and I can address those problems or those situations in the moment, right? I'm gonna show you also as part of the grading and reporting. And this is that would be a webinar on its own, but I just want to give you an example of things that I can do having access to this type of data. You're generating a lot of data because it's digital and you have already assigned things to different categories and different points. So you can look specifically at what's going on. As you can see, I use BookWidgets every single day, but I'm gonna look at this quiz that I gave my students a couple of weeks ago. The important thing about here is when they're taking the quiz, not only I can see things that are happening in real time, I can also see what type of questions they're struggling with in the moment, right? This is something that you probably won't get with other platforms, because if you assign, for example, a Google document, you can see probably what they're doing, but you have no data in terms of what are they struggling with in real time, calculated for you. I did not calculate any of this average. This is already calculated by the program. And I can see that 46% of my students are having problems with this question right here. Question 10, the branch of biology that studies the distribution of plants and animals in a particular area, right? So I can click on that. And right away, I would have a list of students who got the question right, but I will also have the list of students who did not get the question correct, right? So I can have that instant access to what's going on specifically within my classroom at any given time when I assign worksheets through BookWidgets, right? So that's a powerful feature, and that on its own has been one of those tools that has improved my effectiveness as a teacher, knowing in real time what are the questions that they're struggling with, what are the questions that are doing good, and being able to leave feedback for those students in the moment. They don't have to wait for me to go to my home and start looking at their papers and looking what they got right. I could know what they're doing right at the very moment they're working on, and I can know what they're struggling with at the very moment where they're facing those questions, right? So besides that, I always get, a detailed description of things that are not going well for some students or going right with some students. I also get the median. I get the average of what's going on in the class in terms of the points assigned to each question. This alone, from a scientist perspective, from a scientific perspective, this is a game changer. It has been a game changer in my classroom instruction. Being able to, anything that I assign to my students, being able to monitor what's going on in the classroom real time, and then after they finish their assignments, being able to provide feedback to all the students that are working on this specific assignment, it's technically has made my life way easier, but I think I've become a more effective instructor just having that kind of data available to me at that time. So we've talked about implementation of these strategies, and as part of our agenda, I know I have only scratched the surface of many of these tools, but hopefully I entice you to try BookWidgets or look for different ways, if you're already working with BookWidgets, other ways in which you can implement different strategies to spice up things in terms of the way in which your students can demonstrate knowledge and comprehensions of the concepts you are dealing with. So having said that, it's 3:48 in my time, but I would like to open it up for any questions and answers you might have about the content we've shared so far. Thank you for your time, and look forward to answering your questions.